Food is one of the most powerful ways to influence our longevity, to influence our health, but we've been largely getting it wrong as it relates to the reasons why. And why this is the case is because we have built a food system in the United States and increasingly around the world that prioritizes something that is not quite food. So today we're going to be talking about why we are kind of messing it up as it relates to optimal nutrition for longevity and the path back to health. We're going to talk about the last several decades of policies and changes in the United States, and actually many of this relevant to you wherever you live around the world that have kind of subsidized and made more easy the consumption of ultra processed foods and why that has been an absolute disaster for our health. And then we're going to talk about, where we're at right now with recommendations around dietary guidelines and where we need to be going in terms of the key pathways that have been conclusively linked to longer lifespan. We'll also be talking about the difference between just living a long life and having a long and healthy life, and why research is showing that changing our diets may be the single most powerful thing we can do to extend our lifespan. I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Again, I'm the Chief Science Officer here at Big Bold Health. And if you're interested in this type of research, if you're interested in this type of conversation, make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, to our newsletter. You'll get access to all of this type of content, tons of science, tons of resources. We love sharing it with you. So again, if this is something that is interesting to you, make sure that you're subscribed. So I'm going to go ahead and start up my deck here. And again, the topic of today's lecture is food for longevity. And really, we're going to talk about what went wrong and how do we get back to health. So just briefly on me, I'm a board certified internal medicine physician. I went to medical school and then residency to focus on understanding the causes of chronic diseases and what we could do to help to mitigate those issues. But I've largely shifted my focus in the last 10 or so years towards understanding this intersection between food, the immune system, and brain health, and trying to find ways to bring this research to the forefront so that people, whether or not they're able to get access to high level medical care, get to know this information, get to use this information to help to not only treat disease, but prevent disease. And two of the papers that I've published in the last few years include the paper we did at Big Bold Health we published in 2024, looking at how polyphenols, these plant-based nutrients in our diet, can influence longevity-related pathways. If you haven't already checked out that study, I'm obviously a little biased, but I think it was one of the most interesting ways to look at the power of food is medicine. So it's called The Impact of a Polyphenol-Rich Supplement on Epigenetic and Cellular Markers of Immune Age. The other study, which I published a few years back, looks at the interactions between the immune system and mental health. In particular, how revving up inflammatory pathways is linked to worse mental health in the context of depression. So that paper you can also see here. You're welcome to look at it. It's free, open access. And what I was postulating there is that we have to be paying attention to how multiple pathways in our environment can converge to influence our brain health and in particular our mental health. So enough about that. Let's talk about what we're going to actually be discussing today. Three major sections in this conversation. And if you're watching this live and if you have questions about what I'm discussing, put them in the little question tab at the bottom of your screen. And if you're watching this after the fact, let us know what you liked or don't like about this presentation. Let us know what was interesting to you, what you want to hear more of. Put that in the comments. It's incredibly helpful for us and especially for me so I can customize this content to be more valuable to you. So three parts today in this lecture. The first part, what is longevity? And if you've heard me speak before, you know that this is a sticking point for me. I think we're getting conversations around longevity wrong because we're focused on the wrong variable. The second part is going to be, what are we actually eating? Which is an interesting question. It's not exactly food. And why are we eating what we now define as food? And then the third part is, what do we do about this information? So sure, there are lots of things that are wrong. What can we do right now to help to right the ship? Disclaimer, as always, this is purely for educational purposes. This isn't a doctor-patient relationship. I'm not recommending you go out and do certain things, and you should always work with your healthcare practitioner before making changes to your healthcare protocol. So part one, let's define longevity. If you're in the wellness space, if you've been in any way involved in healthcare in the last decade, you know that longevity is one of the most popular topics. There are many very popular books that have been written on this. It's all over podcasts, news stations, and it's even making its way into these longevity clinics where the goal is to help you live a long life. But the reality is that longevity is not the goal. And these two people here could be the exact same age. They're both living the same duration of time, but the quality of their years is dramatically different. And so we need to move away from purely talking about longevity to breaking this down into two variables. So the number of years we live is lifespan. But the quality of those years and the duration of those years matched with quality, that's what we're talking about, which is health span. And the goal here, from my perspective, is not simply to live a long life. I've had many people I have known who have developed significant medical issues like Alzheimer's and still were able to tack on an extra decade to their lives, but the quality of those years certainly not all that optimized. So the goal here is not just duration, but quality of those years. And as we're looking at what we can do to improve both quality and quantity of our years, diet, food, top of the list. So this is a study that came out a couple of years ago. It's a modeling study. And what they found is that if a person at age 20 was to move their diet from the standard diet that most people in the United States and arguably in many countries around the world are eating now, which is a Western pattern diet or a standard American diet, towards an optimized diet, that could add between 10 to 13 years of lifespan for these people. So this is not a trivial thing. If you want to live a long and healthy life, diet is absolutely top of the list in terms of things you can implement right away to make those changes. So very briefly, better food promotes longevity. Longevity, we need to be talking about lifespan and health span. Diet is one of the most powerful levers for how long we'll live and the quality of those years. And if you were to simply make the change from a standard diet to a more healthful diet, that could add over a decade to your lifespan. So when we're thinking about what an optimal longevity diet is, it's not just about what we're eating, but it's also about what we are not eating. So part two is then, what are we actually eating? What are we eating? We are now eating ultra-processed food. This is a term you might have heard about before, but to define it, ultra-processed foods, these are industrial formulations of processed foods that typically contain unnatural additives like colorings or emulsifiers. That's a little bit broad. One way to look at this is, to what extent have humans messed with this food? So just adding a little bit of salt to a food isn't an ultra-processed food. But when you get to the point where it is something that remotely resembles a vegetable, but has now been highly processed, you find in the middle aisle of your grocery store, and it has 20 different ingredients that you've never heard of before, chances are that is an ultra-processed food. Why ultra-processed foods are concerning is not just the things that are put into them, but also because they are basically designed to use the cheapest ingredients possible, and they use these industrial processes in order to scale out production. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that because an ingredient is cheap that it is bad for you, but it is important to understand that one of the primary motivators with this massive influx those are in the United States, those tend to be things that are directly counter to what is good for our health. So as they describe in this paper, and I'll be referencing this publication, this is from the journal The Lancet multiple times in this conversation, they say the alternative to an ultra-processed diet is a healthy, sustainable diet that supports lifelong health, development, and well-being without compromising the food security and nutrition of future generations. And I think this is also interesting conversation specific health, but there is a challenge in basically saying longevity is about prolonging the lives of a very small subset, the 0.1% by a decade while leaving everyone else behind. And I think as we're talking about longevity, expanding that conversation beyond just what is going to be best for me and my tiny little bubble to what is actually best for populations is a really key piece of the puzzle. So let's talk a little bit about the nuance, the detail, the statistics as it relates to what people are consuming. And this is United States data. Again, you can generalize this to many countries around the world. Basically, what you see is as countries move up into these higher income countries, they tend to consume more ultra-processed foods. What we're seeing now, though, is middle income countries are now the quickest rises in ultra-processed food consumption. So this is basically a publication that comes out from NCHS, which is the United States, and they were looking at ultra-processed food consumption in youth and adults. And what they found is in terms of percentage of calories that people were consuming, that across all age groups, that roughly 55% of calories come from ultra-processed foods, roughly split 55 male and female. When you look at younger people, so ages 1 to 18, you see that this percentage rises up to about 62%. When you look at 19 and older, so that would be basically adults, it's about 53%. There's a lot that can be said as to why this is concerning. I think the main takeaways from this would be that the youngest people in the United States are those consuming the most of their calories from these junk foods. And when we think about where people are actually consuming their ultra processed foods, its top four sources would be sandwiches, sweet baked goods, savory snacks, and sweetened beverages. So just to put this into the context of where is this coming from, certainly if you're eating some cookies, we could consider that an ultra processed food, but sandwiches, actually number one. Savory snacks, top of the list as well, and sweetened beverages, which you may have heard me say before, there's really no nutritional value to consuming a sweetened beverage. So there's lots more we could discuss as to why they're especially problematic. I will note it's not all bad news. Based on these data, there has actually been a decrease in the consumption of ultra processed foods over the last 10 years. And I think it's important to counter this. It's easy to say the narrative is people continue to get worse, our diet continues to worsen, but in some ways, people are actually improving their diet a bit in terms of their total consumption of ultra processed foods. Some quick stats here in case you're talking to other people and they're saying, well, I don't know, the American diet doesn't seem all that bad. Realize that about 74% of the foods and beverages in the American food supply have been sweetened. And that's from sugar, that's from artificial sweeteners, but we have conditioned ourselves and companies have conditioned us to only consume foods and beverages when they are sweetened. And that is a big issue because, as I just mentioned, especially as it relates to sugar sweetened beverages, there is good data showing that higher consumption of sugar sweetened beverages is linked to things like worse brain health, worse mental health, worse cardiovascular health. So we need to pay attention to these data. The average American eats 34 teaspoons of sugar a day, which is about 500 extra calories. And while it is true that there is more to nutrition than simply balancing calories in versus calories out, 500 extra calories a day is not something to sneeze at. The average American now is spending about 39 minutes on food prep and cleanup. And that's interesting for a number of reasons. We're going to talk in part about why ultra processed foods are now the most popular foods, but people are spending less time preparing their food now. Of course, it makes sense if you're busy, you're not going to necessarily want to spend 2 hours preparing an elaborate feast. But one of the things that has dramatically changed in the United States and in countries around the world is the degree to which we are connected to our food and spending time actually considering what we're putting into our bodies. Americans also consume 23% more calories a day than they did in 1970. Again, it's not all about calories, but calories do matter, especially when those extra calories, as I just described, are coming from ultra processed sources. So now a question. Why are we eating so many ultra processed foods? You could say, well, it's because the food industry has simply made them so delicious that we can't turn away. But there's actually a much more interesting storyline that gets us to where we are now. So after World War II, there was this scaled spread of industrialized food production, monoculture systems that started in the United States and kind of spread throughout the world. And at the time, it made a lot of sense. We wanted to standardize this process to make sure that we were able to produce a whole bunch of food reliably so everyone had enough calories. But they especially went after women with gender norms. So they were telling these women, basically several decades ago, look at how easy this will be. Look at how convenient this will be. You won't have to spend hours a day making this meal. Give your family a TV dinner and move on with your day. I think there are actually some advantages to this in terms of liberating time and providing people with the ability to do other things with their day. But there was a huge downside to this because with this convenience basically came the increase in our consumption of ultra processed foods. And more recently, you may already know this, tobacco companies went out and purchased a bunch of ultra processed food companies to put into their portfolio. They saw that sales of cigarettes were kind of flagging because it became more and more clear that cigarettes were incredibly toxic to health. So they diversified their portfolios by buying these ultra processed food companies and, in essence, leveraged all the tools that they already knew about how to make a product more and more addictive. And we're not necessarily talking about neurobiology, but even just marketing in order to get more people consuming more ultra processed foods. Finally, as you probably already know, massive subsidies exist in the United States and around the world to make ultra-processed foods the cheapest foods on the block. So, based on the data that I pulled here from 2027, about $30 billion were spent in a single year to subsidize seed oils and sugar. Now, we can talk about seed oils if you're interested. I know that's a very popular topic, but the bottom line is to understand that we are basically artificially making ultra-processed foods cheaper, which of course is going to make them more likely to be purchased by an individual. We've also normalized the consumption of junk food, and this has happened around the world. I'm sure many of you are from other countries, or I know many of you are in other countries right now, and it differs depending on where you're at, but it is absolutely the case that we have normalized unhealthy eating in many places without challenging this question of why is this what food looks like? Now, we're going to get here into a little bit of, I wouldn't say politics, but we're going to talk a little bit about what we're learning right now around how we're educating people around food. So, around 2005, the United States released the food pyramid. You've probably seen some variant of this. What this pyramid did was, in essence, recommend that people consumed more carbohydrate, the base of the pyramid, carbohydrate, and it kind of deprioritized things like oils, specifically fats. Why that made sense was because at the time there was this concern that consuming more fats was linked to higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and therefore we should push people away from the consumption of fats towards anything else. And so carbohydrates kind of occupied the easiest answer to that equation. So there was a recommendation to consume lots of carbs. It's important to note that this has been iterated on many times. So we're talking about many decades ago was that first food pyramid. So it is incorrect to say that this is what was recommended up until this year. People were not using the standard food pyramid that's many decades old, but what we have seen is kind of this migration towards various versions of educating people on what to prioritize around their diet. So prior to the new inverted food pyramid coming out, this is what we had, some variant on the choose my plate, which in essence made your plate look something like this. Eat some fruits, eat some vegetables, eat some grains, eat some protein, and then you can have some dairy. And if you, there's actually a very large document that describes all the details, but if you do something like this, that is a more or less balanced diet. So fast forward to, I don't know, about a month ago, with the release of the new inverted food pyramid in the United States. If you have questions, if you have comments, leave those below. Everyone's going to have an opinion on this. I have my opinions on them, and it's not exactly necessarily what Big Bold Health's opinions are on it, but I think there are certain things about this inverted food pyramid that are great, and other things about it that don't make much sense based on what we know about nutrition. What was the case, however, in these new dietary guidelines is a prioritization of minimally processed food and a general move away from ultra processed foods, which I completely agree with. And so here's a quote from the recent nutrition dietary guidelines saying American households must prioritize diets built on whole, nutrient dense foods, protein, dairy, vegetables, fruits, healthy fats, and whole grains, paired with a dramatic reduction in highly processed foods laden with refined carbohydrates, added sugars, excess sodium, unhealthy fats, and chemical additives. That statement makes a ton of sense. The challenge, of course, is to say, okay, we've told people that this is what they should do. What are people actually going to do? Which gets us back to some of the challenges around things like subsidies, which we'll discuss in a moment. So going back to this recent Lancet publication, so this was a series of articles talking about ultra-processed foods and the risks posed to human health. What they describe here is that global proliferation of ultra-processed foods has become one of the most urgent yet inadequately addressed threats to human health in the 21st century. I agree with this. So why are so many foods ultra-processed food? It's because they are the easiest foods to create. We take these massive monocultures of things like corn, wheat, soy, palm oil. We engineer them into food, and this is basically controlled by a handful of international corporations. There's a very small set of groups that basically own this entire industry. The ultra-processed food industry generates enormous revenues that support continued growth and fund corporate political activities to counter efforts at ultra-processed food regulation. And I think this is a part of the conversation we have to address. It's not all about just eating a healthy diet. We need to be aware that these things are happening behind the scenes to make unhealthy foods easier for people to find and healthy foods less available. One of the things that really hits for me, and I'd be curious if it does for you, leave us a comment below, is what this is doing to kids. If you think about a child's brain, I mean, recent research actually shows that the brain doesn't finish maturing until your 30s, which is really nice for a lot of people as a cover. But we do know that the most rapid rate of change of the brain, the pruning of synapses, the creation of new pathways between our neurons is happening in early childhood. And this is the time that ultra-processed foods especially go after brains. So what they describe in this paper, children are uniquely vulnerable to ultra-processed foods and ultra-processed dietary patterns. Taste preferences are formed in early childhood, and repeated exposure to ultra-processed foods create lifelong preferences for sweet, salty, and artificially flavored food. And I think that is a big problem. What they talk about as well is that ultra processed foods are aggressively promoted in children's daily environments. This means avoiding exposure is nearly impossible and helps normalize a lifelong consumption of ultra processed foods. And I don't know what it was like for all of you. I know you're coming in from many other countries, but the standard in many schools and what I experienced is that you would go to your sports field for your local baseball team and an ultra processed food company would be the sponsor. There are even lesson plans that are sponsored by ultra processed foods, which I have reviewed, and you can see in my articles on this. Basically, teaching you how to do multiplication, but also selling you on French fries. There are also a lot of incentive structures in various schools. If you do well, let's say, and get a good grade on a test, they will reward you with some free donuts. And there are so many reasons why this is problematic. It's not just about giving a kid a treat, it's about conditioning their preferences for ultra processed foods and creating this tether to reward at an early age. So, how do ultra processed foods co opt kids' health? These companies fund research that basically shows that there's no major issues with ultra processed foods. They market to kids in classrooms, on TV, and everywhere else. They lobby politicians not to intervene on behalf of children. They threaten legal actions, and they create concern around economic implications. Now, again, I know this isn't designed to be necessarily a political conversation, but we do need to understand as it relates to the optimal diet for longevity, this just isn't about telling people, here's what you should eat that is healthy. It's about creating scenarios where a person is able to actually go out and choose those foods. And if we condition children from a young age to have a preference for ultra processed foods, it's going to make the likelihood that they choose a healthy, longevity promoting diet even lower. And I'm sure all of you out there, let me know in the comments, are probably still struggling with conditioning from your early years. I know I have some, my favorite cereal growing up. It's still something that I have a proclivity to choose because in those early years, it changes our brains to make us more likely to choose them in years to come. I also want to comment on this willpower issue. So, one of the most popular covers that I see ultra processed food brands use is this idea that, well, you got to leave it up to the consumer. Yes, this food is terrible for you, but you got to let people make their own choices. There are so many problems with this. If junk food is intrinsically cheaper, then it's not as though it's a one-to-one decision. And you're blaming somebody for choosing the cheaper food when it's basically going to be more affordable. Roughly 2.6 billion people around the world simply can't afford a healthier diet. So this isn't just a question of saying, hey, eat some more healthy foods. It simply isn't affordable. And again, we're subsidizing the junk. Governments tend to take the easy way out. They say, well, let people make their own choices, protect consumer choices. And for a number of reasons, that is not a logical conclusion. One of the most powerful from my perspective is when we wire our brains from a young age to make the unhealthy choice the obvious choice, it's such a cop out to basically say, well, we're giving people the opportunity to choose what we would like. And so, for this and other reasons, I think willpower is an issue. Beyond this, we know that ultra processed foods are degrading the collective environment. So even if we're going to blame a couple of people for not having the right willpower to say no to a junk food meal, we're actually decreasing the quality of this planet's health by allowing ultra processed foods to continue to be the norm. And as they say in again one of these Lancet papers, the rise of ultra processed foods in human diets is being driven by the growing economic and political power of the ultra processed food industry and food systems nearly everywhere, not by any lack of individual willpower or responsibility. So while I'm all for agency and while I will tell all of you, go out today, start making healthier choices, these are the systemic issues that are driving so much of why people continue to eat junk food. And it is such a easy cop out for companies, for governments to say, well, people should just make better choices. So some of the things that we need clearer messaging that food is an ultra-processed food. You're all learning a whole lot about nutrition. You probably care about whether there's added sugar in your food, whether it's been ultra-processed. You read the ingredients, but we need to make it clear to children and to adults whether or not a food is an ultra-processed food. I think there should not be marketing of ultra-processed foods to kids, full stop. We also need to consider making it more financially easy for people to purchase healthy foods and making it less basically straightforward for ultra processed foods to be the easy choice in stores. So more subsidies on healthy foods and less subsidies on ultra processed foods. Finally, we just need to make healthier foods more accessible and available. All of this feeds into, yes, it's great to have new dietary guidelines, but if we can't make it feasible, if we can't make it easy for the average American or person around the world to choose a healthier food, then it could just be something that is basically a marketing effort that isn't followed through on. It doesn't actually change our health. Okay, I do want to talk about the personal agency piece. I said this isn't a willpower problem intrinsically, but if you can understand how diet influences longevity, and if you can become a model of health for yourself, for your family, for your community, these things absolutely have ripple effects. You can't change another person's behavior by simply telling them, here is what you need to do. I have experienced this many times in a clinical setting, telling patients, hey, you're eating junk food, you're drinking soda, don't do that anymore. And that's not the right way to do it. But when you model health, when you make healthy decisions, when you choose to exercise, when you choose to eat healthy food, when you choose to say no when somebody gives you a cup of soda, that type of stuff has a ripple effect. So the fact that you're all here today, that you're caring about this, you're interested in this, just realize that you are making a positive impact beyond yourself by modeling healthy behaviors. So that's part two of this. What I want to really emphasize is that in the United States and increasingly around the world, roughly half of our calories come from ultra processed foods. So we need to start with understanding that the norm is eating junk food. Ultra processed foods are not just the most popular foods because they are tasting good, but also because we have these massive subsidies and industrial scaling that drives their production. They have been incredibly powerfully marketed, especially to children, to get us to change our taste preferences at a young age. And they had been engineered to be maximally convenient and to taste in an incredibly amazing way, even if that isn't in any way good for our health, using incredibly nuanced technology. So this isn't a willpower failure issue. It is a structural food system issue, and we absolutely have to keep that in mind. Okay, for the third part of this, we're going to talk about what do we actually know about the link between longevity and food. And it's easy to go to this idea of saying, well, it's about eating one food that's going to boost your longevity or avoiding one food that's going to boost your longevity. And while there are some data on individual foods, so I'm a big fan of, let's say, olive oil, and I'm a big fan of decreasing added sugar consumption, the reality of it is that there is some nuance that links longevity, food, and specific pathways in our physiology. And so three of those pathways that we're going to talk about today are how our food can influence longevity through metabolism, immunity, and the microbiome. How can food influence metabolism? You've heard many people talking about metabolism in the last few years. So metabolism is basically the conversion of energy from the outside of our body to energy in the inside of our body, and it's also the synthesis and use of the building blocks and the breakdown products of those building blocks throughout our bodies. So one of the ways that an ultra-processed food can basically harm metabolism and lead to a shorter lifespan and a shorter health span is that we have a general surplus of nutrients. Now, it is true that if you eat an excess of calories, that can create strain on your body. I'll emphasize this again. It's not the only variable, but if you are eating 500 extra calories a day from sugar, which is what the average American is doing, that overall surplus of nutrients, specifically these ready-to-use carbohydrates, creates an anabolic overload on the body in a negative way. We're not talking about anabolic building of muscle, we're talking about storage of fat. In addition, certain nutrients can directly impair insulin and glucose signaling. Now, we're not going to get into all the nuances of metabolism. We're going to talk about a little bit of it, but it is important to understand that as we look at glucose and insulin signaling, these are some of the most perturbed systems in people in the United States. There are data now suggesting that over 90% of Americans have some aspect of metabolic dysfunction. We know that roughly half of Americans have some aspect of glucose intolerance, meaning that they have higher levels of glucose and responses to glucose than what would be anticipated. And one of the things that directly links that to longevity is the understanding that these states of altered insulin and glucose signaling are correlated with shorter lifespan. And then finally, mitochondrial inefficiency. You've heard of mitochondria, these powerhouses of the cell, and we know that the food that we eat can influence mitochondria, not can, does influence mitochondria, and that if we eat too many of certain types of nutrients, that may actually harm their efficiency, which is one of the kind of key constituent elements that has been linked to longevity or shorter lifespan. In terms of the nutrient surplus, the pathways that are worthy of your knowledge, especially, if you're a biohacker, I'm sure you've heard of this ad nauseum, but there are kind of these two push and pull pathways in our metabolism. Mammalian target of rapamycin or mTOR, and then AMP kinase. So this is, if you've heard of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, this is adenosine monophosphate kinase. And you can't really have both of these activated at the same time, nor would you want to. You actually want to have a balance of these two things. mTOR is more of a building pathway, so it's an anabolic pathway. AMP kinase is more of a catabolic breakdown and cleanup pathway. We want both of these. According to data in animal models, when you activate AMP kinase, when you activate autophagy, when you activate a cleanup model, that's actually shown to promote lifespan. So that's an interesting question. Then, should humans be chronically activating AMP kinase? The answer is no, because many of these models that basically show AMP kinase activation correlates with longevity won't necessarily be feasible for humans. For example, perpetual caloric restriction. Chronic mTOR activation over AMP kinase activation may promote obesity, cell stress, and immune dysfunction. So how does all of this relate to the nutrients in an ultra-processed diet? When we are perpetually consuming high levels of these nutrients that keep our body in an anabolic state, we're perpetually activating mTOR, and that can over time actually degrade our chances at a long and healthy life. Now moving to the insulin glucose signaling. So as I said before, impairments in insulin and glucose signaling correlates with a shorter lifespan. The earlier these impairments begin, the more powerful the effect. And so about 50% of Americans have impaired glucose and insulin sensitivity, and about 90% of Americans have some aspect of metabolic dysfunction. And I know you're saying, well, I don't live in America. This can't be relevant for you. It is, because what we're seeing is that metabolic dysfunction is creeping up around the world, and it is often below the surface and not something that is being tested for until it is really set in. An ultra-processed diet directly impairs metabolic function, and so one of the things to consider is, do you know about your insulin and glucose sensitivity? And if not, it may be something worthy of checking into. Finally, mitochondrial function. So mitochondria, again, these powerhouses of the cells, but they do so much more. When we look at animal data, boosting aspects of mitochondrial function are linked to increased lifespan, and aspects of ultra-processed diets seem to directly impair mitochondrial health. One of the most strongly correlated variables linked to mitochondrial dysfunction in terms of diet in animal models is fructose. So if you think about carbohydrates or proteins or fats, it's easy to loop them all in at the same level and say, well, fats are bad, carbs are bad, protein is great. The reality is that there is nuance. And so when we look at carbs, when we look at monosaccharides, so these are single carbon sugars, or single molecule sugars, we see that fructose is different from glucose, and glucose and fructose kind of come together to form sucrose, which is table sugar. But fructose, so you could think of that being at a higher level in a high fructose diet or high fructose corn syrup, may be specifically impairing mitochondrial function. Saturated fat, again, it's a nuance. There's different types of saturated fat, but in mice models, consuming more saturated fat seems to be impairing mitochondrial function. And then inflammaging. So this aging of the immune system that is correlated with problems with immune balance is also linked to mitochondrial dysfunction. You've heard me probably talk, and if you haven't, check out our other YouTubes and the other lectures that I've done on this channel, but how the immune system correlates with longevity and how inflammaging in particular correlates with longevity. One of the key pathways seems to be that the immune dysfunction leads to issues with mitochondrial function. Finally, dietary ultra-processed food is linked to obesity and alterations in mitochondrial metabolism at a high level. So by basically altering our fat distribution, this is linked to impairments in mitochondrial health. Pathway number two, and what we're really focused on here at Big Bold Health, is immunity. Immune imbalances are linked to ultra-processed food consumption across age demographics. If you eat a standard American diet or a Western pattern diet, you statistically are more likely to have impairments in immune system health. And so that is a very basic level as to what is happening that links longevity, the immune system, and food. But when we look at this immune imbalance, we see that that predicts shorter lifespan and more rapid aging. So when we eat an ultra-processed food diet, it impairs immune health, and that then leads to a whole bunch of negative health outcomes, including correlations with a shorter lifespan. We're now starting to see that certain ingredients or molecules within food not only can be pushing our immune system towards an aged immune system, but could also pull it back towards a more youthful immune system. So these are molecules that are being looked at as xenotherapeutics, that they target what is called senescence or aging of our immune system. Then the final pathway here is pathway number three, the microbiome. There is a whole lecture I did on this topic on our channel that you can look into if you're interested. But the microbiome changes as we go across our lives. And certainly the first year or so is the biggest change. But you can see all the way through to a very late years, centenarians, that there are these consistent changes across the microbiome. And these changes are linked to longevity and health outcomes. There's also some data using a technique called Mendelian randomization, which is complicated, but in essence, that data is able to show that there are causal relationships that link the microbiome to longevity, suggesting that it's not just incidental that the microbiome changes as we get older. And many studies are now commenting on this, and actually many companies are looking at this. Can you target the microbiome as a way to go after aspects of aging? As it relates to how we can change the microbiome, diet is one of the most important variables. So sure, antibiotics and other things, but for most people and most of the time, the single biggest thing that you can do to optimize your microbiome is to eat a healthy diet. And what I mean by healthy, I will define towards the end of this lecture, but what we're talking about here is a diet that is not ultra-processed foods. So in the last little bit here, and I'll say again, if you have comments, questions, or anything you'd like me to focus on for future lectures, leave it in the comments below or in the questions. If you're watching this after the fact, leave it in the comments, let us know. But let's talk about what an actual diet looks like that has been linked to longevity. So in a 30-year study of dietary patterns in over 100,000 people, there's a new dietary index. It's called the Alternative Healthy Eating Index. And this is a Harvard generating eating index. It's actually a new bit of manipulation of variables. But what they found is the people who ate a diet that was strongest in terms of this alternative healthy eating index had a 2.24 times more likely to make it to a later age with health. So what is in this diet? What is in this index? Nothing all that groundbreaking. More vegetables, more fruits, more whole grains, more unsaturated fats, more nuts, more low-fat dairy. But what it's less of is trans fats, sugary beverages, red meat, and sodium. Let's take a little moment here to talk about red meat. People have strong opinions on this right now, and there are certain people who are proponents of, let's say, the carnivore diet who will say that red meat cured X, Y, or Z condition. What I will say is, looking at the macro data, red meat consumption has been pretty consistently linked at the higher levels with negative health outcomes. And if you're going to be consuming red meat, you definitely don't want to be eating processed red meat, which has been consistently associated with worse health outcomes. Now, certainly there are different types of red meat. One of the issues with red meat is it's very high in saturated fat. And again, saturated fat doesn't necessarily increase cholesterol in the way that people thought was a problem. But when we're looking at the types of fats that have been most strongly correlated with longevity, saturated fat may just be neutral. But unsaturated fats have been strongly correlated with longevity. And we're not just talking about generically seed oils, polyunsaturated fats. What we're talking about is monounsaturated fats like you might get from avocados, from olive oil, from nuts and seeds, as well as from sources like polyunsaturated fatty acids, which you could get from seafood. So going back to that new food pyramid that is inverted, I think placing the red meat at the top of the food pyramid relative to what the average American would benefit from consuming more of doesn't really make all that much sense. And so I'll just pause there on that one. There's more to be said on that topic. I'll also call out from this specific study, the Alternative Healthy Eating Index, that compared to even popular diets like the DASH diet, which is the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, and the Mediterranean diet, that this index won out. Now, this doesn't mean that you should just drop whatever healthy diet you're eating and go directly over to the Alternative Healthy Eating Index, But I do think it's important to recognize that we're continuing to learn about what actually are the most optimal diets for longevity, and it may not be exactly what we thought about before, with the caveat being that every diet I have ever seen that's been strongly correlated with longevity is a diet that has a relative balance of diversity of nutrients, and more importantly, it is a diet that deprioritizes ultra-processed foods. So what are the key nutrient groups that have been correlated with longevity? A high polyphenol diet. You've probably heard me talk about this many times. Polyphenols are these incredible molecules found within plant-based foods. We tend to lose them when we eat ultra-processed foods. They're rich in herbs and spices. This is why we're studying Himalayan tartary buckwheat because it's exceptionally high in polyphenols. But based on this study, which is the Green Med Direct Plus study, they found that people who added around 1,240 milligrams of extra polyphenols a day for 18 months had a slowing in several parameters related to how fast they were aging using epigenetics. You heard me talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA. These are omega-3 fats. In a recent study, they found that people who had higher levels of EPA and DHA had actually slower levels of biological aging. And they found in one study that dosing at around 1 gram a day for around a year was correlated with a slower rate of biological aging. We know omega-3 supplementation, and that, as I mentioned just in the study, at around 1 grams was linked to slower biological aging. And then added sugar. Friends, if you do one thing today as a result of what I'm describing to change your diet, please look at your added sugar consumption. And especially if you're drinking sugary beverages, that is a top tier thing to stop doing. Also, fiber. Fiber, you may have heard people talking about fiber maxing. I feel like it's getting more publicity now, but higher fiber correlates with longer life. One thing I'll say here is about protein. So, if you're interested in protein, we've done several lectures on that topic. People have different opinions on protein. There are not good data saying that the people who eat the most protein necessarily live the longest lives. But going back to the new dietary guidelines, which now basically go from zero point 0.8 milligrams per kilogram to now we're talking about 1.2 to 1.6. So this is different. We're talking about consuming more protein than we used to. Sorry, that should be grams. 1.2 to 1.6 grams. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I do think consumption of more protein is of value with a bunch of caveats in place. If you're interested to hear my take on that, comment below and we'll do another video specific to protein intake. But increasing protein intake is not necessarily correlated with longevity. In fact, some data suggest that eating more protein, especially in earlier years, may have the opposite effect. However, as we get older, we build up what's called anabolic resistance, meaning it's harder for us to utilize amino acids and protein to build muscle. And what has been very clear is that the loss of muscle as we get older, a term called sarcopenia, is correlated with frailty and potentially with a shorter lifespan. So again, lots more I could say on that around the protein connection, how much protein to dose per day. But I do think for many people, increasing from zero point 0.8 to 1.2 to 1.6, which is now what is recommending, may not be a bad idea. So what does this diet look like? Well, it is a diet that prioritizes minimal ultra-processed foods. It's a diet that prioritizes vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds. For protein consumption, there are data suggesting that if you're going to choose your protein, seafood and legumes, definitely better than processed meat. Of course, in between here is poultry and red meat. What we're saying here in terms of what we know, seafood and legumes, definitely better than processed meat. And in between this, there's a lot more to talk about. High nutrient density, so healthy fats, polyphenols, and fiber. Beverages, if you're going to drink a beverage, try to make it an unsweetened beverage. If you have to use a sweetener, my current list would be stevia, monk fruit, allulose, but if you can, try to condition your palate so that you're not requiring so much sweet. In terms of the best beverages for longevity, there's some data on tea in particular. So green and black teas may be some of the most advantageous beverages. Why is this? It's because these are teas that are incredibly rich in polyphenols like EGCG. And so I personally try to drink tea as much as I can. That's one of the reasons. Healthy fats. So as I said before, in terms of the hierarchy of fats, saturated fats may not be as bad as we once thought, but unsaturated fats, in particular, these monounsaturated fats that we find in plant-based sources, I'm not talking about seed oils, I'm talking about in real plants like nuts and seeds, avocado, olive oil, something that I would definitely recommend you consider in terms of the amount of data we have on that. And I know what people would say, well, what's the difference between different types of olive oil? There's some data suggesting that if you drink usual standard olive oil, it's about 50% of the olive oils in the United States that have been cut with inferior oils like vegetable oils. So try to get extra virgin olive oil and try to get single country of origin if you are choosing that. And then there are some data now on fermented foods. We don't have big data saying that if you eat kimchi, you're going to live to 120, but we're starting to see more on the links between gut health and longevity. So if you're interested, try some kimchi, some sauerkraut, include it in your diet. It's something that I try to do each day. Some other things to consider here. So, sharing meals when possible. This is not necessarily the food itself, but how you eat the food. In a study that was published by the World Happiness Report, they found that sharing meals was shown to be a strong indicator of subjective well-being across 142 countries. And we are moving to an isolated, lonely society. I get it. You're sitting there by yourself. You want to scroll on your phone while you're eating your meal. Sometimes that's fine. But if you can create an opportunity to share your meal, that's an amazing way to help to boost the benefits of eating a healthy meal. In the United States, 1 in 4 Americans reported eating all meals alone the previous day, and that's gone up by about 53% in the last couple of decades. There are many reasons for that. We're not going to get into all the things that have happened with our isolation and loneliness and social media, but if you have the opportunity to spend a meal eating with friends, good idea. What else? So major things to consider when we're looking at longevity, it's not about adding a food into your diet for a few weeks. We're talking about sustainable longitudinal food changes that have been most consistently linked to a long life. Enjoyable changes. So if you have to slog down something that you absolutely hate each morning because somebody told you on some podcast that that was going to fix everything about your health, you're probably not going to stick to it. Instead, try to incorporate healthy eating into sustainable changes that are also enjoyable. If you can build in community, so much the better. And what about organic? So people have different opinions on organic. What I would say is it's not the single most important variable. And if it were me and I had to choose between eating an organic food because it was an organic food versus a food that I know to be healthful, like an apple, I would definitely choose the apple, even if it was conventional, as opposed to eating something like an ultra processed organic food. I know what you might be saying, but isn't the apple sprayed and all these other variables? What we have data for in terms of longevity is that eating a minimally processed diet as much as possible is the best thing to do. And if you can also afford to purchase organic, that's what I choose to do, but I don't think it should be the number one variable. What's more important for me than simply asking, is this or is this not organic, is let's talk about the health value of that food. So at Big Bold Health, we obviously have organic foods, for example, our Himalayan tartary buckwheat. But what's even more important to us is understanding how that food is grown. So that's why we're pursuing ROC. We have now regenerative organic certification for the farms we grow Himalayan tartary buckwheat on, because now we're looking not just at the organic, so we have the seal, but what is the quality of the soil that influences the quality of the plant, that then influences the health potential of that plant when consumed. So I would just say organic, but with an asterisk. More important is to understand, is the food itself actually healthful? And whether or not it's organic is not the single most important driver of that. So what a longevity supportive diet looks like. It's a minimal ultra processed food diet. Everyone's going to have their ratios here. If you go to a birthday party and somebody purchased, these ultra processed cupcakes and everyone's eating one and you want to eat one, fine. But the main point is most of the time, try to eat minimally processed foods. And as it relates to what are in those minimally processed foods, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, seafood and legumes over processed meats, unsaturated fats like olive oil and nuts, high fiber and polyphenol density. If you're going to be optimizing your beverages, which I hope you are, choose an unsweetened beverage. And if you're really wanting to dial it in, green tea, black tea may be the top of the list. Fermented foods we're still learning about, but they may offer additional benefits. Share your meals when you can and look for sustainable strategies in terms of foods, not only that you think that you can purchase regularly, but also that you enjoy eating. So important. So some key takeaways here. Longevity nutrition is not about perfection. If your goal is to live a long and healthy life, what you do on an individual day at an individual meal doesn't matter that much. What you do over the course of years and decades matters a ton. So be thinking about the long run. Be thinking about, how do I prep myself to make healthy eating the norm for me? And if you slip up Fine, everyone slips up. This is not a question of did you eat one junk food meal? Did you eat one or drink one junk food beverage? This is a question of can you sequentially optimize your diet to make it just a little bit more healthful. It's about decreasing our intake of ultra-processed foods, increasing nutrient-dense whole foods, and in general trying to align it with these metabolic, immune, and microbiome health tenets for as much of the time as we can. So with that said, I'm going to close down the lecture here and let me stop my share. I just want to say thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much for caring about longevity and nutrition.